Welcome. Today, we're going to be looking at specifically a blog post that I found really fascinating called Have You Read the Wikipedia Definition of Reiki?
Interesting.
By Bronwyn Logan.
Okay.
And she kind of takes Wikipedia to task for their definition.
Okay.
So I thought it'd be fun to kind of dive into this blog post a little bit and see what she has to say and kind of get your take on it.
Sure.
So to start off with, I'm just going to read the Wikipedia definition that she quotes in her blog post, and that is, Reiki is a pseudoscientific energy healing, a type of alternative medicine originating in Japan.
Yeah.
So what are your initial thoughts on that definition?
Well, I think she makes a really good point in that the language is very loaded, right off the bat, pseudoscientific,
Right.
Alternative medicine.
Right.
It's already kind of putting it in this box of like fringe or, not to be taken seriously.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting starting point.
Yeah, and she really kind of goes after that term, pseudoscientific.
Yeah.
And she says that Reiki is not something that can be scientifically proven because it's not a science, it's a spiritual practice.
Right.
And it's meant to bring about well-being and balance, not necessarily something that you can measure.
Exactly, yeah.
So what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that that's a valid point, or do you think there's still room for some kind of scientific inquiry when it comes to Reiki?
I think that there's always room for scientific inquiry when it comes to anything that we're trying to understand better.
Right.
But I think her point is that it's not appropriate to apply a purely scientific lens to something that is inherently spiritual and experiential.
Right.
It's like saying, okay, we're going to measure how much someone is meditating by, how much their brain waves are changing or something.
Right.
It's like you're missing the point. The
Right.
point is the subjective experience.
Right. And she even uses the analogy of it's like saying meditation is like a failed nap because it's not about, falling asleep. It's about something else entirely.
Yeah. Right. It's a different state of consciousness,
Yeah.
a different state of being.
Exactly.
And that's not something that you can necessarily measure with, traditional scientific methods.
Right. And so she kind of challenges this idea that the only things that are valid or effective are things that can be scientifically proven.
Right.
And she really emphasizes the importance of personal experience and cultural context when it comes to understanding something like Reiki.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because it's not just about Reiki. It's about how we approach different ways of knowing and different forms of knowledge.
Right.
In Western culture, we tend to privilege scientific knowledge above all else.
Right.
But there are other ways of knowing that are just as valid and important.
Right, like lived experience.
Exactly.
And, anecdotal evidence and things like that.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we need to be more open to, especially when we're talking about health and well-being.
Right.
Because it's not always about what can be measured in a lab. It's also about how people feel and what their experiences are.
Right. And so how does she see Reiki fitting into the bigger picture of healthcare?
Well, she definitely doesn't see it as like an alternative to conventional medicine. She sees it as complementary.
Right.
She says that Reiki practitioners aren't trying to replace doctors or medications.
Oh.
They're trying to work alongside them.
Gotcha. So it's more about adding another tool to the toolbox.
Right.
Not throwing out the toolbox altogether.
Exactly.
Okay, so for those listeners who might be unfamiliar with Reiki, can you give us just like a really brief overview of what it is?
Sure. So in the simplest terms, Reiki is a Japanese energy healing technique.
Okay.
The practitioner uses gentle touch or sometimes no touch at all.
Okay.
And the goal is to promote physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being.
Okay. And where did Reiki originate?
Reiki was developed in Japan in the early 1900s by a man named Mikao Usui.
Okay.
And he believed that everyone has the potential to tap into this universal life force energy and use it for healing.
Interesting. So it's not just about, treating specific illnesses or ailments. It's more about kind of like a holistic approach to well-being.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. And so Bronwyn mentions in her blog post that Reiki can have all sorts of benefits.
Right.
She talks about, supporting people during chemotherapy, promoting emotional healing, fostering compassion. I mean, that's quite a range.
It is. And it really speaks to this idea that Reiki is addressing the whole person.
Right.
Mind, body, spirit.
Right. And so this is where her critique of the Western gaze kind of comes into play.
Yeah.
She argues that the Wikipedia definition, with its emphasis on pseudoscience, fails to appreciate the cultural and historical context of Reiki.
The people who are editing Wikipedia are often coming from a particular perspective.
Right.
And so they may not be as open to information that challenges their worldview.
Interesting. It definitely suggests that we need a more nuanced understanding of this ancient practice.
Yeah, for sure.
But it also begs the question, what does it take for a practice to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the medical establishment?
Right. Is it scientific evidence? Is it widespread adoption?
Right.
Is it something else entirely?
That's a really good question.
It really makes you think, about how we define proof when it comes to healing.
Yeah. If we only focus on what's scientifically measurable,
Yeah.
are we missing out on other forms of healing that might be just as effective, even if we don't understand, like, the mechanisms behind them?
Right. And I think that's a really important point that she makes in the blog is that, we shouldn't discount the power of personal experience and anecdotal evidence.
Right.
Like you were saying about the Canadian nurses who were documenting the effects of Reiki.
Right.
I mean, that's valuable information, even if it's not a double-blind, placebo-controlled study.
Right. And I think it speaks to this shift that we're seeing where people are becoming more open to exploring different possibilities.
Yeah.
Even within like traditional medical settings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's a growing recognition that health and well-being are multifaceted.
Right.
And that there isn't always a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. It's about like a more holistic approach.
Exactly.
It's about like adding, different tools to the toolbox.
Right.
And so one thing that really struck me about Bronwyn's blog post is that she frames Reiki not just as a treatment for, specific illnesses, but as a pathway to like self-awareness and greater balance.
Yeah, she talks about it as a way to tap into this universal life force energy.
Right.
Which is something that we all have access to.
Right.
And she says that when we can connect to that energy, we can experience greater well-being.
Right. And she talks about all these different benefits, like support during chemotherapy, emotional healing, fostering compassion.
Yeah, it's really quite a range.
It is.
And I think it speaks to the power of this practice, that it can have such a profound impact on people's lives.
And this is where her critique of the Western gaze comes in. She argues that the Wikipedia definition, with its emphasis on pseudoscience, fails to appreciate the cultural and historical context of Reiki.
Right. She says that practices like meditation, chanting, and hands-on healing were, and still are, deeply ingrained in Japanese culture.
Right.
And that to label Reiki as pseudoscience is to completely ignore that context.
Right. It's like we're looking at it through this very narrow lens.
Exactly.
And so by doing that, we're missing out on like a whole world of understanding.
Right.
So how do you think we can approach these kinds of practices, with a more open mind and a greater appreciation for their cultural and historical context?
Well, I think the first step is to be aware of our own biases. We all have them.
Right.
And it's important to recognize how those biases might be influencing our perceptions.
Right. So it's about like being more self-aware.
Exactly. And I think it's also about being willing to step outside of our comfort zones.
Okay.
To explore different ways of knowing and different ways of being.
Right. And to not dismiss something just because it's different from what we're used to.
Exactly. And I think that's really the key to expanding our understanding of the world.
Right. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like what the future of Reiki might look like.
Well, I think that Reiki is becoming more and more mainstream.
Okay.
As we were talking about earlier, it's being offered in hospitals, it's
Oh.
being researched by scientists,
Right.
and I think that trend is only going to continue.
So it's possible that, in the future, Reiki might be seen as just another part of integrative medicine?
Exactly, and I think that would be a really positive development.
Right, because it would mean that more people would have access to this powerful healing modality.
Right, and that it would be more widely accepted and respected.
And it wouldn't be seen as this like fringe or alternative practice.
Exactly, it would just be seen as another tool in the toolbox for promoting health and well-being.
Perfect. And for our listeners out there, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.